Part 2. Today we're going to have a quick 1-minute recap of where we left off on Monday. Then we're going to actually go right into the pieces and parts of a grant application, starting out with some of the administrative documents, then writing the actual research plan itself. We're going to look at some grantsmanship tips. I'm going to quickly go over the review process so you know once your grant's submitted what happens to it. And then I've provided some helpful websites and resources for future use. So just to recap, we left off on Monday looking at the outline of a grant. And I mentioned that a grant is made up of administrative documents, or what I call administrative documents, and then the research plan. So we're going to take a look at the administrative documents, and the research plan we'll also look at. The research plan goes from section A through J. Today we'll concentrate mostly on A through E and a short bit on section E, which is the human subject section. So let's start out with the administrative documents. The first document on your grant application will be your face page. A couple new rules and points to consider when filling out this page is that the title cannot be more than 81 characters. That includes spaces. Remember to check if you're a new investigator. There's a box on there that asks that. I know it's difficult to see from your viewpoint, but there's a box that asks if you're a new investigator. And that's important because the peer reviewers may judge you on less stringent criteria. They'll focus more on the proposed approach than on your track record. So it's good to note if you're a new investigator. Now, if you're an investigator that may have held a K grant, like a mentored research career development grant, or a planning grant, or a small planning grant, you're still considered a new investigator at that point. So, keep that in mind. Something else to note is boxes 7 and 8, which asks for the cost, should not include any of your consortium's indirect cost or your subcontractor's indirect cost. There's a web link there that explains that rule in more detail, but it's a fairly new rule. About a year ago, if you had a subcontractor on your grant and they had indirect costs, those indirect costs counted as your direct costs. They no longer do. So that actually helps you from a financial point of view. So. Also, you must have original signatures on your face page. You cannot use electronic signatures or per signatures. After the face page comes the table of contents. This is the standard table of contents for an R01, but if you're applying for a different mechanism, just read the directions. Sometimes you're asked to modify this table of contents, but for the most part, this is probably what most people will use. Again, I know you can't really see this too closely from where you are, but it's a pretty broad table of contents. And I always encourage investigators to put a more detailed table of contents right before the research plan. And I'll show you an example of that as we get further on into the lecture, but it will help the reviewers kind of find things, whereas this is a pretty broad table of contents. After that, we have the description, or the abstract page. People often refer to it as the abstract page. You must stay within the allotted space. That box, if you save it on Word and unprotected, it tends to expand as you type. Don't let it do that. You really need to stay within that space. Also, the abstract now, it requires you to include 2 parts: a project summary and the project relevance. So let's take a look real quick at the project summary. The project summary should be a succinct and accurate description of the proposed work. It should state your application's broad and long-term objectives and specific aims. It should include the relevance to the mission of the agency you're applying to. And it should describe concisely the research design and methods for achieving the stated goals. Now that will fill up most of your page. The part 2 is the relevance. It should only be 2 or 3 sentences and should obviously follow right after part 1. It should describe the project's relevance to public health. It should be succinct and use plain language that can be understood by the lay audience. So again, the focus here really is on part 1, but don't forget to put a sentence or 2 about a sentence or 3, 2 or 3 about part 2 at the end of the abstract. Afterwards comes your detailed budget for year 1. Again, at the bottom of the budget, it's going to ask you for your consortium and contractual costs, and make sure the indirects are separated and not rolled into one total. Show the NIH the 2 costs for your subcontractors, their direct cost and their indirect cost. Continuation pages may be used. So there's probably about 7 lines up there for your personnel. If you have more than 7, you can use a continuation page, and I'll show you in a few minutes what a continuation page looks like. And avoid listing lots of people with a small percent of efforts. The next page is the budget for the entire proposed project period. The NIH only requires that you provide a detailed budget for year 1. Years 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, you only need to provide totals, and those totals would go on this page. The next thing we're going to look at, I'm not ready to go there yet, but would be the budget justifications. And you can start the budget justifications right at the bottom of this page. You see that there's a white space to start that. Of course, that's not probably nearly enough room. So you would want to use a continuation page. And that's what we're looking at now, the continuation page. I often actually just start them on this page, but that's up to the investigator. Some points to consider. There is no page limit to the budget justification, so be as detailed as possible, especially in the personnel section. Explain what each person is going to be doing for your project. Include a short description of the qualifications and background of that specific person. In reading and editing budget justifications over the years, people tend to talk about how great they are and their qualifications, but never really say what they're doing for the project. And actually, I'm going to give you an example of that in a second. It's also nice, although not required, it's also nice right up front to include some key project assumptions that you use to build your budget. Afterwards, after the assumptions, should you choose to include them, you need to organize the remaining document according to the categories on the PHS budget form, which is the year 1 budget form. And they are listed here: personnel, consultant costs, equipment, supplies, travel, patient care costs, alterations and renovations, other expenses, and your consortium contractual costs. So organize your budget justifications in that fashion. I mentioned including key assumptions for the reviewers so they kind of have an idea on how you developed your budget. Again, it's not required that you include this. I just believe it's helpful. It's helped us in the past when we've needed to justify supplemental funds. It's helped us to go back and say, well, we only included X amount of patients, and now you've asked us to recruit twice as many. It helps justify the need for supplemental funds. So I've just given some examples here of key assumptions. I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but you can kind of see where I'm going. You can make this a list as detailed as you want or as broad as you want. And I know this is probably, well, I know this is written from a coordinating center point of view, but the sites should be able to adapt a similar type thing for single center site grants. I mentioned the being detailed on the personnel description, and I've just provided a sample here of how to write one. Up front, we talk about Dr. So-and-so and his appointment here at Duke and his qualifications. But then we have a equally impressive paragraph on what this person's going to do for the project. Often people forget that second paragraph and tend to talk about how wonderful they are. So just make sure the reviewers come away with a sense of not only how wonderful you are, but what you're going to be doing for the project. Once the budget justifications are complete, the Biosketch is next. I encourage you to customize your Biosketch for each specific grant. It should not exceed more than 4 pages, and items A and B together should not exceed 2 pages. So items A and B are your appointments and your honors and your positions. B are your publications, and C is the research, your past research support and your ongoing research support. So A and B together should not exceed 2 pages. Then comes your resources. This should describe the scientific environment in which the work will be done. It should discuss the proposed research, how the proposed research will benefit from the unique features of your scientific environment. If there are multiple sites, you should consider including their resources. And this is only 1 page, but you can use a continuation page, so you're not limited to this 1 page. I forgot to mention that on the bottom of all these slides, there's a link that tells you, provides some more supplemental instructions on filling out these specific pages. So that link is the same link on just about every slide. Now, in the outline, what comes next is the research plan, but I'm going to skip over that because we're going to finish through the administrative documents and come back to the research plan. So after the research plan, which comes after the resources, you would fill out a checklist, which simply tells the NIH the amount of indirect costs you're requesting. Most institutions have a grants office or an office of research support that would fill this out for you, but I know some institutes don't, so that is a definite must. And then the final administrative document is the personal data form. It's an optional form. It's not required to go with the grant, and it's only supposed to be filled out for the principal investigator only. The original form should be included with the original application, but it should not be attached to any of the copies. It does ask you for your Social Security number, but the regulations have been changed recently. They only ask you for your last 4 digits. And this provides the NIH some data and allows the NIH to monitor its review and award process to detect any and to deal with any inequities of race, sex, ethnicity. So now we're going to look at the specific parts of the research plan. Before you develop your research plan, you need to first develop your hypothesis. You need to provide a rationale for your hypothesis and make sure it's based on current scientific literature. A good hypothesis should increase the understanding of normal biologic processes, diseases, or treatments or preventions. Your proposal should not be driven by should be driven by a hypothesis, not by advances in technology. In other words, it should not be a method in search of a problem. And remember to state your hypothesis in both your specific aims section of your research plan and the abstract. I stress that because as we get further into the presentation, we're going to talk about the review process, and not all reviewers will read your entire grant. They may only read the specific aims section and the abstract, so it's important to include those there. So then the first section of the research plan is your specific aims. It should be about a page. That's a recommended length. It's not a hard and fast rule. You should begin this section by stating the general purpose or major objectives of your research. Be sure that all objectives relate directly to the hypothesis you are setting out to test. Keep in mind that your research methods should directly relate to the aims you have described. Remember to state or recognize alternatives to your hypothesis and explain why you chose the ones you chose. Choose objectives that can easily be assessed and reviewed by your study section or your review committee. And make sure not to confuse specific aims with long-term goals. Section B is your background and significance. Again, 2 to 3 pages is recommended, but certainly not a hard and fast rule. Keep the statement of significance brief. State how your research is innovative. For example, how does your proposal look at a topic from a fresh point of view? And how will your proposal develop or improve technology? Show how your hypothesis and research will increase knowledge. In other words, relate your hypothesis and plan to the longer-term, big-picture scientific objectives and to the betterment of public health. Justify your proposal with background information about the research field that led to the research you're proposing. The literature you include in this section is going to be very important because it shows the reviewers that you understand the field and have a balanced and adequate knowledge of it. Continuing with the background and significance section, use this opportunity to reveal that you're aware of gaps or discrepancies in the field. Make sure to show familiarity with unpublished work, and identify the next logical stage of research beyond your current application. Section C should be about 6 to 8 pages, recommended. This is an extremely important section. It'll help the reviewers build confidence that you can handle the technologies, understand the methods, and interpret the results. Your preliminary data should support the hypothesis to be tested and the feasibility of the project. Explain how the preliminary results are valid and how early studies will be expanded in scope or size. Make sure you interpret results critically. Showing alternative meanings to results indicates you've thought through the problem and shows the reviewers that you can meet future challenges. Keep in mind that preliminary data can consist of data of your own publications, publications of others, or unpublished data. And make sure to include manuscripts submitted for publication, that have been submitted for publication. Section D. Section D should be the remaining 25 pages of your sections A through D. I stress that you should organize this section to correspond with your specific aims. I've read lots of research plans, and you'd be surprised how many times in the specific aims section, there's aims 1, 2, and 3, but the research plan starts out with 3, then jumps to 2, then goes back to 1, and then hits 3 again. Think about that. Try to maybe organize your, or even worse, they don't even mention the specific aims. So I would advise, just for the ease of the reviewer's ability to read the application, to organize your research plan according to the specific aims. Describe your study design and procedures in detail and give a rationale for their use. If your methods are innovative, show how you have changed existing proven methods while avoiding technical problems. Also, make sure to describe why new methods are advantageous to the research you propose to do. Make sure you call attention to potential difficulties you may encounter with each approach. Reviewers will be aware of these problems, so convince them that you can handle these problems in such circumstances. And propose alternatives that would circumvent any potential limitations or problems you may encounter. Be detailed, be detailed, be detailed. Show the reviewers that you can understand the work. While you may assume they may be experts in the field, they're not assuming that about you. So details will show them that you understand what you're doing and that you can handle the research. Show the reviewers that you will be able to interpret your results by revealing you understand the complexities of the subject. Obviously, many applications benefit from statistical analysis, so the early involvement of a statistician will be key. Describe your proposed statistical methods for analyzing the data you plan to collect, and make sure to define the criteria for evaluating the success or failure of a specific test. Section E is an interesting section because how section A through D, while there are no specific directions on how to organize those, there is specific directions on how the NIH wants to see section E set up. So you'll notice at the bottom of the slide, I provided a link. This link is actually a little bit different than the other links I've provided because there's a whole book I'm exaggerating a little bit, but there's a whole web link associated with how to fill out your human subject sections. Now, perhaps you're not using human subjects, or perhaps all sections may not apply. For example, you could be doing research, but maybe you don't need a data and safety monitoring plan. I would still encourage you to organize your section in this way, and if something's not needed, state that this section is not applicable, and state why you think it's not applicable. I'm not going to go through every single sections E1 through E8, because the directions are very good on telling you what's needed, but certainly I would definitely organize your section E in this fashion. That's very, very important. And it's somewhat of a new rule, I would say, within the last 2 years. So investigators who haven't written a grant in quite a while tend to not realize that this is a changed rule. We're going to look now at some grantsmanship tips. Well, first we want to make the reviewers your advocate. We want to make it easy as possible on them to review your application. We want to grab their attention, obviously, and we don't want to make them work at it. This is a picture of a review session in process, and these people are sitting in a tiny hotel room, and it's probably day 3, and they're all tired. So the last thing they need to do is read your application or have to discuss your application and remember it being one of the more difficult ones to get through. So that's why I stress to make the reviewers your advocate and make it easy for them. You're going to have several different levels of reviewers. You're going to have a primary reviewer who you're going to have a couple primary type reviewers that are going to actually take your application, read it word for word, come back to the group, and present it. And then you're going to have these 3 gentlemen who were probably just assigned as a discussant, who were provided your application but maybe didn't read the whole thing. Maybe they skimmed it, or maybe they read sections, maybe they only read the abstract or the specific aims, or maybe they're even reading it right now as the primary reviewer is up there giving the lecture. So that's why it's key to make sure your specific aim section and your abstract are as tight as possible, because some reviewers will only read that, and they'll only read that at the time the application's being discussed. Don't they look excited? I mentioned the table of contents early on in the presentation, and I showed you the form that the NIH requires you to have, but this is an example of a table of contents that I've included right before the research plan, which is much, much more detailed than the table of contents that the NIH requires you to fill out. This will not count against your 25 pages. And so including something like this helps the reviewers find exactly where they need to go to read a specific section of interest. Again, it just makes it easier for them. Anything that makes it easier for them is a plus. Leave some white space and use some headings. 25 pages is not a lot, and I know people tend to take out all the spacing and use the smallest font possible, but I provided kind of a bad example and a good example, and you can see the good example includes headings and includes some white space. It's just nicer to look at. And again, while the content is exactly the same and you may suffer a little bit on the page spacing, the page numbering, I would still encourage you to use the good example again, because it just, as a reviewer, looking at a grant and see nothing but black text throughout is just exhausting before you even begin reading. Use diagrams and tables. I've provided 2 examples, one with a nice little org chart and one with an abbreviations table. We often tend to use lots of abbreviations in our grant application, so providing one right up front is a good idea. I do caution that I have worked on grants where the abbreviations are so many that literally there's a page of abbreviations. So just be aware of the abbreviations and how, balance how big that abbreviation table should be. I don't know that there should be a page of abbreviations. If so, you might just want to consider spelling some things out all the time. Most of the tables and charts and figures will be reproduced in black and white, so if there's really something that it is important to get color, it's important to get a meaning across by using color, make sure you put those color charts and figures and tables in the appendix and state that in your research plan. Figure 2 is also included in color in your research plan because the NIH, you will make copies and the NIH will make copies and they'll come out in black and white and it may distort it a little bit. So if there's something that's really necessary, in fact, I would actually try to do most things in black and white anyway, but if you can't, make sure to put the color copy in the appendices. Be detailed about how you're going to do things. We talked about this in section D of the research plan. Instead of talking about how you're going to enroll 100 subjects and follow them every 3 months for 2 years, discuss the role of the study coordinator and how he or she will help you enroll those patients and how you plan to carry out the follow-up questionnaires. And this is an example of a very vague enrollment plan and a very detailed enrollment plan for your use. Anticipate objectives and address them proactively. For example, we considered using a mouse model but decided on rabbits as their organs are more easily dissected and more applicable to our target. Again, just a simple example of explaining why you chose to do one method over another. A couple of other additional grantsmanship tips. Include letters of support, including a letter of support from your chairman or from the dean of your medical school, or if you've had a K grant, a mentored career development grant, perhaps a letter from your mentor stating that that person believes you're ready for independent research. So letters of support are key. Obviously, pay attention to flow, tell a story. It's better to use the active rather than passive voice. Keep ideas and information together. In other words, put clauses and phrases as closely as possible and right after the words they modify. Simplify and break up long, involved sentences and paragraphs. In general, it's nice to use short, simple sentences. I know we all want to sound as important as possible, but your goal here is communication, not literature. Don't write for the specialist. Make sure that not everybody on your review committee may be as much of an expert as you are, so make sure you are writing for those reviewers who may not be specialized in your area. And edit redundant words and phrases, proofread thoroughly, look carefully for errors and grammatical mistakes, omitted information, and errors in tables, figures, graphs. The take-home message here is that sloppy work will suffer in review. If the reviewers feel your application is sloppy or disorganized, they're going to possibly make the same assumption that your research will be also. And if they decide not to fund your research, they will remember your application the second time around, and you just don't want to get a bad reputation. So do as good as you can on the first try. So you've submitted your application, and now it's gone to the NIH. We're going to take a quick look at the review process. There's a six-step review process, and step 3 is what I really want to concentrate on today. It's the peer review process. It's the people who take your application home, read it, and score it. So step 1, your application goes to the Center for Scientific Review. The Center for Scientific Review is kind of like a clearinghouse for all grants. So every grant goes there and kind of gets shuffled to the appropriate parties. So the Center for Scientific Review will first check your grant for compliance with the NIH rules. If you remember in session 1, in part 1, we went through a bunch of little rules about fonts and type size and a bunch of little margins. Those people are going to get out their rulers and they're going to check. They're going to make sure you haven't gone over the budget limit, if there is a budget limit. They're going to make sure you haven't gone over the page limits, and that your research plan is sections A through D are 25 pages. And they're also going to double check to see if this is your second or third revision. So they have you in a database. They know when they get an application received for a second time. The second thing they're going to do is assign your application for review. So they're going to read your application as much as possible to decide what study section it should go to. Now, one thing we'll discuss in a little while is you can influence where that application goes to. You can write a cover letter that requests your application go to a specific study section, and I'll show you in a little bit how to find that. Then the Center for Scientific Review will send a notification to the investigators and to the grants office via ERA Commons. ERA Commons is an electronic website that the investigator can log on to find out where their grant is, who's reviewing their grant, when it's going to be reviewed, and then you'll get a grant number associated with your application. Today we're not going to focus on how to use ERA Commons. That's not in the scope of this presentation, but most of you should have grants offices that can help you get passwords and get logged on, so you can find information like that. Step 2. After CSR, once CSR assigns it, it'll go to the scientific review administrator. That person will ensure that the application referred to him or her is appropriate, that CSR did their job appropriately. That person's going to recruit and identify the reviewers. It's going to interact with the study section chair. It's going to assign the application to he or she's going to assign the application to the specific reviewers and distribute the application to the reviewers. So the scientific review administrator will have a large hand in deciding who are your primary reviewers responsible for coming back and presenting to the group, and who are maybe just your discussants who may not read the entire application. So step 3 is really what I want to concentrate on today. Your study section, or your peer reviewers, there will be about 10 to 15 reviewers on a panel. They'll receive your application package about 4 to 6 weeks prior to meeting. Some reviewers will be an actual reviewer where they will be required to read your application in detail and write a complete critique, and also come back to the larger group and make a presentation regarding their findings. And then there'll be discussants where a written critique is not required, and the level of review may not be quite as stringent. The reviewers will give your application a score from 100 to 500, 100 being the best, 500 being the worst. Applications in the lower half, and when I say lower half, I really mean upper half, because it's the worst score is the 500. So applications that have higher numbers may be streamlined. What that means is if your reviewer comes back and says to the group, I believe this application should be streamlined, I'd give it a score of about 300, so let's not even review it. As long as everybody in the review panel agrees with that person, your application won't even be discussed, and they'll just move on. So again, I stress the importance of your abstract and your specific aims, because even changing the mind of one person, even if it's just a discussant, it just takes one person to say, no, I want to discuss this application in detail. I thought the specific aims were really good, and I have some questions, so let's discuss it. And it only takes one person to do that. And then your application won't be streamlined. Just because your application is streamlined, you'll still get the written comments, because those have already been typed out, but they just won't discuss it face to face. And many times during the discussion period, the project officer is there, and you can, after you get your critique back, you can call your project officer and get kind of the inside scoop or the between the lines reading. If that discussion doesn't happen, obviously that person can't help you. So you never want to have your application streamlined. Even if you don't have a good score, you'd like to have it discussed. So here's the review criteria. The peer reviewers or your study sections are going to review your grant on significance. How does this study address an important problem, and how will this project advance scientific or clinical practice? They're going to look at the approach. Are the design methods and analysis well developed and appropriate for the aims? Is your project innovative? Does it challenge existing paradigms or clinical practice? Is the investigator experienced enough and well suited enough to conduct the work? They're going to look at your letters of support to see what other people have to say about you. And is your environment appropriate? And so not only will they critique you on these criteria, but your summary statement or your pink sheet will come back in this order. Then it's going to go back to the step 4. It's going to go back to the scientific review administrator. That person is going to organize the meeting. They're going to get everybody back in the room in that nice little hotel room for a few days. He or she is going to determine the order of review. Going to work closely with the study section chairperson who will run the review portion of the meeting. Your scientific review administrator will keep notes for the summary statement and then actually produce the summary statement. I don't know if you've noticed, I've had the term summary statement in pink all throughout, because oftentimes people will refer to summary statements as pink sheets, because a long time ago they actually used to come in on pink sheets. They don't anymore, but people still use that term. So if you hear the term pink sheet, what was your score? Did you get your pink sheet back? It's simply your summary statement, but I put it in pink here to kind of stand out. So your summary statement will be sent to the PI at this point. The SRA will send it to the PI, and you'll be able to take a look at your score and your written critique. And the summary statement will also be sent to the advisory council. Now, the advisory councils are groups of people within the specific institutes and centers who will review the summary statement and decide whether funding is available, if that institute or center has funding available. So peer reviewers or review study sections do not fund grants. Advisory councils fund grants on the basis of the funds available within that institute and center and on the basis of the recommendations that were found during the study section review. So advisory councils fund, study sections do not fund. So they'll read the summary statement and review it, ensure that the review was conducted fairly. They're going to keep their institutional priorities in mind. They may approve your project with or without changes, so they could actually decide that they want to fund aims 1 through 3, but not aim 4 at this point, because aim 4 doesn't fit nicely in with the institute's priorities. Or they could defer for another review. So just because you get a great score, if it's not going to fit within the institute's priorities, it's not something they want to fund, they could turn it down. But let's assume you've written the greatest grant possible, and the advisory council will send it to the program officer within that institute or center, who will send a notice of grant award to the PI as well as the grants office. That person will be your primary contact from here on out. They'll monitor the progress on the grant and serve as the scientific and programmatic contact for the principal investigator. And just to remind you that in Part 1, I stressed how important it was to get the program officer, or the project officer, sometimes we call them, involved early on to help guide you through what those institutes' priorities are and to help you write the best grant you can. Now, I also mentioned that the Center for Scientific Review would assign your grants to a study section. Well, what they really do is assign it to an integrated review group, and those integrated review groups are listed up here on the slides, and within each of those groups there are study sections. But you as the PI can choose where you want your grant to go, or you can certainly at least recommend it. Most of the time, CSR, when they receive your letter, and it says, I want my grant to go to the AARR group, they'll typically comply with your request. So the integrated study groups are kind of the first level, and within each group, there are the study sections. So just as an example, this is the, these are the different study sections within the CVS review group. And you can click on, on the previous slide I had a web link that would list all the integrative review groups. Then you click on that and it'll give you all your study sections. Then you click on your study sections and you can actually see who the reviewers are. So you'll know their names. And it's important to think about this, even not at the last minute when you're writing your letter and you're making your copies, but it's important to think about this early on because it would be nice to maybe use some of the literature that the review panel has written. So it's to have their names and to know who's going to be reviewing your grant is helpful. You can see what they've done in the past and what their interests are. Going to look at the timeline real quick. It's about a 9-month process from the time you submit your proposal until the time you can start. Now, I've started out with a to be determined time frame regarding when you're going to develop your proposal, but I would give yourself at least 6 months of planning and writing. But if you submit your proposal on October 1st, it'll be February or March of the next year before your study section reviews your application. A month or two after that, you should receive your summary statement, and at that point you'll have an idea of whether you're going to be funded or not, but you certainly won't have an actual award notice in hand. A couple months after the summary statement is received, the advisory council will meet, and about a month after that, if you're awarded the project, you'll get an actual award notice letting you know the terms of the award. So it's about a 9-month process. Now, there's a lot of helpful websites and resources that you can use, and everything I just discussed today can be found on the NIH website. So the NIH Guide to Grants and Contracts is very good. The application forms you'll need to download to complete your application. The grants and funding opportunities, we talked about that in part 1. That'll give you a list of all the open RFAs and PAs. You can look at the request for grant application. Again, it just provides some additional information and instructions. How to write a research grant application is a very, very helpful website, and a lot of the information I presented today was taken from that website. So I would encourage you to read through that. The NIAID has a section on their website called All About Grant Tutorials, which includes a page of information that's just absolutely wonderful. It includes grant application basics, how to manage your grant award, how to plan a grant application, how to write a grant application, plus much more. Again, they're great resources. The NIH also has included on their website an annotated R01 and a summary statement. So you can actually go and find a grant that somebody has written and given permission for the NIH to post on their website, and you can see the reviewer's comments as it's annotated throughout. The Center for Scientific Review is a good website. You'll learn a lot of information about their policies and procedures. The peer review process, which I know we went through, but depending on the type of grant you apply for, the peer review process can be a little bit different. I kind of covered the generic R01 peer review process, but there are more details on this web link. If you actually really want to watch a peer review process in progress, you can actually watch a video of peer reviewers in action and discussing grant applications. And then I've given you the web links to find the integrated review groups and study sections that you can choose and you can include in your letter. And that's it for part 1. So if there are any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them. Sure. Oh, sorry.
Thank you. I have a question with regards to the method section within writing a research plan. You clearly highlighted that this should be done as detailed as possible. In one of the previous lectures we had in this session, and we discussed writing manuscripts as well, and we also discussed the method chapter within a manuscript in detail. And what was and how we were instructed is that the method section within a manuscript should be in so much detail that the people that read the manuscript should actually be able to repeat the experiment. So my question is whether the aim of writing a method section in the research plan should have that aim as well.
I would say yes. You want to be as detailed as possible. Now, your limited manuscripts are not my area of expertise, so I don't know what kind of, if there's page limits on those kind of things. But I realize your page limits will prevent you somewhat. I would try to be as detailed as possible. If you're really stuck and you can't do that within the page length, you can always include information in the appendices to supplement the detail. The risk you run is that the reviewers are not required to read the appendices and may not. So if there's something that is really, really important, I would leave it out of the appendices, but that is an option. But I would try to be as detailed as possible.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, I think that's all. Thank you, everybody.